The protagonist is the fourth daughter of an ordinary poor knight, and so she appeared before the emperor of her country in a bow, who wondered is she really that Riddlecross. At the time of their meetings, she was 18 years old, and after the appearance of magical abilities, the girl met with the ruler, who said that from now on he would call her Nightcross. And from that moment, the empire counted on her. The protagonist was confused by this because she was truly enchanted by the emperor, and so she became the youngest spellcaster in the empire. But things didn't go as smoothly as she thought from the beginning. She was eventually transferred to a room where she was to live and do her work as a spellcaster, and when she was brought to a room in a tall tower, she was told that she would be living here. But this obviously raised a lot of questions, so the girl wondered if there was some mistake, because this place looked more like a prison than a normal place to live. But suddenly, the emperor, surrounded by his servants, appeared, and with the coldest and most serious face possible informed that it was not a mistake, and Riddlecross would indeed live here since she was now a Nightcross. The first duty was that Riddlecross was to create a magical barrier that would prevent the invasion of the kingdom of Azinda and the Duchy of Duke. Upon hearing this, the protagonist was horrified and went to the emperor and told him that in order to stop his enemies, they would have to put up magical barriers throughout the empire. And the emperor agreed, saying that it looked plausible enough, and said that it would be her responsibility. Then he took his sword out of its sheath and said that the second requirement was that the barrier of the protagonist be so strong that the traveler's sword would not shatter it. At this point, the protagonist couldn't stand it and literally screamed that there was nothing in this world that couldn't be cut by a magic sword. But he only smiled gloatingly, then stabbed the protagonist with this sword, causing a huge wound on her arm. And finally, she fell to her knees, unable to do anything but scream in incredible pain. And looking at this picture, His Majesty the Emperor simply wondered if she was in pain, and then coldly informed that if she wanted to be hurt anymore, she would just have to create a barrier that the traveler wouldn't pierce and promise to be back tomorrow. But of course that sounded more like a threat. Then before he left, he threw her a small glass jar that held a potion, and the protagonist looked at it and realized what was in store for her. Because from that moment on, every day for 10 years was hell for the protagonist. And while she was maintaining barriers throughout the empire, she had to endure the side effects of the magic-enhancing potions given to her by the other spellcasters in the tower. The emperor came and apologized for injuring her with the traveler's sword. She had to drink healing potions for a long time after the injury because the sword had inflicted huge wounds. She tried more than once to refuse the job, but each time, if she again refused to obey, the emperor chose a random inhabitant of the empire and killed him in front of the girl. And she couldn't even die of her own free will. Every time she jumped from the 150th floor of her tower, from the only window in her room, she landed back on the enchanted bed where she lived in agony from day to day. If she did nothing and fell to the ground, the emperor would simply send other spellcasters to her, who would abuse her with renewed vigor and feed her potions like animals for slaughter to keep her working. Lying in her bed, the protagonist, powerless, absolutely did not understand why she was born this way and pondered that if she returned to her 18 years, she would never under any circumstances use her magic again, and she would just want to live a peaceful life and die peacefully. She was awakened by her sister, who wondered if the girl was really planning to be late for her holiday and wondered what time the girl had gone to bed, and then gave her gift. The protagonist, in shock, looking at it, not realizing, is it really the same gift that she received on her 18th birthday once 10 years ago? While she looked at it, her sister said that the girl can leisurely pack and go downstairs. After all, everyone is waiting for her. She ran over to her mirror in shock and started looking at herself in it and couldn't believe that she was 18 years old again, because it looked literally unbelievable, or like a dream that she had had more than once while she was locked in the tower. So she looked at herself and hit her forehead against the wall, but felt an incredible pain, and then she realized that it can't be a dream, and it turns out that she has traveled in time to the past and is now in the timeline. No one knows that she can use magic yet. After that, she tried to use her powers to find out what level of magic she possessed now, and found that even after 10 years of torture, her power was still the same. so her body had also returned to its original form. The protagonist made the decision for herself to settle down as a new maid and smiling happily introduced herself, and also asked them to take care of her. At that moment, she only thought about the fact that she would never use magic again and spend her life normally as a gray mouse. So the maid of a noble family, the perfect role for the normal life she so desired. In the end, the mistress ordered the girl to follow her, and the girl happily did so, and thought that being a maid was a common enough job that no suspicion was aroused. And eventually, she decided to take a job with the Earl of Stingers. His family had enormous wealth from dealing illegal substances in the red light districts, and they also had several gambling houses and loan sharking. So the owner of this house, the Count, was a notorious noble devil. But she didn't care about that. She did her job and helped the other maids and thought that as long as she was here she was safe, because no other people came here who could be dangerous to her. But she could easily leave, so as long as she didn't do anything that would attract attention, she would be safe. Plus, her job as a maid suited her even more than she expected because she lived well enough, especially compared to the times she'd come back from. But she turned suddenly at the noise and saw the mistress giving out commands to the other maids and looking visibly agitated, which was maddeningly uncharacteristic of her behavior in the past. So the protagonist asked her new friend among the maids what was going on because Madame Mamour looked very anxious. But she said with a smile on her face that the reason was that my lady was returning. The protagonist was madly surprised, but then Eris calmly explained to her that my lady was the Count's only heir, and it was Lady Melina Stingers. The protagonist, excitedly looking at her friend, informed her that she had heard earlier that my Lady Melina Stingers had gone on a journey before her appearance. The latter confirmed her friend's guesses and informed her that the girl had returned 2 months later and was madly happy to report that she could finally see Graham. But the protagonist only awkwardly looked at her and asked who this Graham was and why she was so happy. And then Eris still delightedly informed that Graham was the Lord of the Cross of this house, and he had left with my lady, and that he was a young, talented, and most importantly, insanely handsome man. At this moment, the protagonist immediately remembered the face of the Emperor and realized that the previous version of her would probably be insanely excited too, especially when she could see the identity of the most handsome man she had ever met. But she realized that even such a beautiful face could hide a huge cruelty. So it was with great awkwardness that she inquired of Eris why it was Graham who accompanied the lady, for it should have been the stewardess. And it was Madame Mamour who should have accompanied the lady. Then she quickly whispered to the protagonist that there were rumors that the two were lovers, and then admiringly began to gaze at the carriage in which Lady Melina Stingers and Graham had arrived. And then she told Riedel Cross to look at it too, so that she could appreciate Graham's beauty. And Eris said that it was obvious that they were very close and looked very good together, so that it made her sad to realize that she had absolutely no chance of winning Graham's favor. It made her sad to realize that she had absolutely no chance of winning Graham's favor. And then she said that even so, she just hoped that Lady Melina and Graham would be happy together. And the protagonist, shocked watching all this, you realize that this couple really looks like a picture. But suddenly, the man turned around, looking carefully at the protagonist. And when she was able to examine his face, then in horror could not believe that in this house could forget the Emperor, because the mere thought of it plunged the girl into a huge shock. From such horror, she just fell down, immediately hiding behind the wall of the house so that she could not be seen from the street, and did not understand what had happened and what to do. At that moment, Graham was still looking at the window from which the protagonist and her friend had just looked out, and this did not go unnoticed by Lady Melina, who asked what was going on and why he was looking so intently. But Graham only calmly explained that nothing had happened and he had just felt a strange stare, and then told Milady that he would take her inside, as she had not been home for a long time. The protagonist was still shaking in shock, not understanding what to do and how it happened that even after being reborn and returning to the past, when no one knows about her magical powers, she still met the Emperor. This did not go unnoticed by her friend Eris, who excitedly came up to her and touched her shoulder in an attempt to calm her down and asked if the girl had become insanely ill, but Tan was deep in her thoughts about the fact that the face voice, and even the physique of this young man was exactly the same as the emperor's, and could not understand what was going on. So the next moment, as soon as she got her thoughts together, she went straight to Madame Mamer's room and realized that she had no other choice but to quit right now and to escape. Even though she was panicking, she knocked discreetly, and when she was allowed to enter, she took the first steps inside, thinking only that she should quit before she came face to face with that frightening young man, and before he realized who she was. But in the end, she was greatly horrified when she entered Madame Mamer's study and saw that she was now quietly drinking tea with Mr. Graham and did not know how to behave. The woman calmly put aside her cup of tea and asked Riedel Cross what had happened and why she looked so agitated. But the protagonist could not think of anything and could not bear the company of this young man any longer, so she turned around and apologized and said that if Madame had a guest now, she would definitely come back another time. But suddenly, the protagonist was abruptly stopped, and she was terrified, not knowing what to do and ordering herself to stay calm. After all, this man doesn't know who she is and her magical abilities yet, so she is not in any danger now. At which point Mr. Graham asked who the girl was, for he had never seen her before. Madame Maymore rose from her seat and went up to Riedel and said that this girl had been hired while Lady Melina was away, and her name was Riedel Cross. Then pointing to Mr. Graham, she told her that she was their butler. The protagonist, looking in front of her, but not looking up at him, could not even properly utter a single word. So she mentally scolded herself for that and ordered herself to calm down, then bowed to Graham and said that it was a pleasure to meet him. The next moment, the man rose from his seat, and the protagonist couldn't help but notice his resemblance to the emperor that had tormented her for so long. So she trembled with fear, as if now her past life was about to repeat itself so rapidly and there would be no more chances to avoid it. She just mentally tearfully begged the man to stay away because she hated him so much. And the next moment he reached into his inner pocket, but the protagonist, despite the fact that it was obvious that the man was not going to do anything terrible, saw only the moment when the emperor also pulled out his sword and ended up wounding her so badly that her wounds made themselves felt for years. And unable to bear it, she squinted in fear and cried out in tears, expecting the blows, but mentally ordering herself to be strong, for she couldn't end up like last time again. But to her great surprise, the man wasn't going to do anything wrong. Graham calmly pulled out his handkerchief and held it out to the protagonist, asking if she was all right. After all, she was sweating insanely profusely and looked like she was sick. The girl took it excitedly, then looked after Madame Maymore and Mr. Butler, who was about to close the doors behind him. And at the last moment, Graham informed Madame that Riedel Cross did not look well, so he asked her to rest till tomorrow. Then he went away. As soon as they were alone, the woman immediately inquired whether the main character is really okay and how she feels. But the girl only asked in a panic, since when Graham's eyes became purple, the woman was madly surprised by such a thing and said that his eyes were like that since birth. When Riedel Cross heard this, she immediately inquired how long this man had been working here. She was madly surprised at this question and inquired as to the reason for it. And she herself reflected that she had previously thought that Riedel Cross would be quite useful in their house. But she was behaving strangely. The protagonist began to refuse and frightenedly said that it seemed to her that Graham looked very much like His Majesty the Emperor, and the woman only smilingly inquired when Miss Riedel Cross had had time to see the Emperor, because it was obviously strange, people of her position. And then in shock began to think that she really hadn't been to the capital since her rebirth, so she couldn't have seen him. So she had to come up with some excuse. So she said as confidently as possible, but awkwardly, that she had not seen him in person, but had seen the portraits painted by an artist who had been in the capital. But Madame Maymore only grudgingly put her hands to her sides and said that she should not believe these charlatans, for the portraits had probably been altered. On hearing this, the chief character bowed awkwardly and apologized to Madame, and the woman in reply only inquired if she would apologize to Mr. Graham for her conduct. The latter promised that she would certainly do so. Back in her room, the girl excitedly pondered that maybe the Emperor had used magic, but even if he had used reincarnation magic or something else, no one can change the color of the eyes. So she didn't know the reason why the emperor decided to become a butler, and whether it was really him. And she had absolutely no idea who this man really was and assumed that they just might be very similar. Then she thought that the servants had never seen the emperor's face, but that the count had never seen the emperor in person was unlikely. Therefore, the count must have noticed the obvious resemblance between the emperor and this young man. So the protagonist worriedly wondered what was the real reason, but then she resolutely shook her head, interrupting her musings, which were terrifying her. Then she resolutely said that she did not want to know what this man was doing here and whether he was really the emperor, because she did not need to know. And if Mr. Graham is not the emperor, then it would be best for Riedel Cross to see him as little as possible. It's better not to see him at all. It doesn't matter what happens because she still doesn't have magic for others. But suddenly, when one of them got up, a handkerchief fell from her pocket to the floor, which she picked up at once and wondered madly where it had come from. But afterwards, she remembered that the handkerchief had been given her by Mr. Butler. Putting it in her drawer to return later and tidy it up and launder it, the protagonist looked resolutely before her and promised that she would never again live the way the emperor wanted her to live. After that, she diligently began her work and as soon as possible avoided meeting with the butler, who was always near Lady Melina. Eris's friend was looking at the young man in every possible way and literally looked like she was in love. Even during her stay with the other maids, when they were doing their own things, the protagonist paid absolutely no attention to the conversations of the girls about his personality and did not join in the discussion of his beauty. After all, for her, he was just a frightening young man and nothing more. Even Madame Maymore, who was next to her, was surprised by such a reaction from the girl, because she did not look as excited as the other ladies in the house. I've been quietly minding my own business and dusting myself off. And then I thought about the fact that I've been carrying around my resignation letter for a week now, but I haven't run into anything dangerous yet. She smiled happily and realized that her life as a maid would probably be peaceful after all, and that she was in no danger. But from her joyful reflections, she was led out by the serious Madame Maymore, who came up to her and called Riedel Cross by name and said that the girl should follow her, because Madame had something important to tell her. Eventually, they reached the Count's office and the protagonist was agitated and didn't understand how she got here and why Earl Stingers needed her. He only smiled at the protagonist and asked if she was the same girl Miss Maymore had mentioned earlier. He said that she was known for being honest about everything. Then he said with a smile that he had called her because he had a request for Riedel Cross. The protagonist looked at the man and asked what he wanted from her and how she could be useful. And he looked at her with the most serious look possible and told her that his request was simple enough and he only wanted the protagonist to seduce Graham. The girl looked at him shocked and told Earl Stingers that she had probably misheard his request and asked him to repeat it. But in the end, to her dismay, he repeated that he wanted Riedel Cross to seduce the butler. The girl absolutely did not know how to react to such a thing. So she tried to squeeze out a smile and said that she did not know Mr. Graham at all, so she was not suitable for this role. And she thought about the fact that earlier she had thought that the worst development of events would be the order to become the mistress of the Earl himself. But in the end, what he said was even worse. But afterward, Earl Stingers looked seriously at the protagonist and said he understood the unexpectedness of such a request and did not blame the protagonist for her reaction, but inquired if she had heard of the gossip between Lady Melina, his daughter, and Graham the butler. Remembering these two, she immediately thought about the fact that many people say that the young man and the lady are very close, and they look like a great couple, but then the protagonist awkwardly realized that she had said it out loud, and immediately faltered, covering her family with her hand. But Earl Stingers did not pay attention to this and said that he was not surprised by such words on the part of the protagonist. After all, his daughter and the butler are really very close, as they spend a lot of time together. He blamed himself for allowing it. He had hired Graham the butler only because Melina wanted him to, but the Earl didn't like the fact that there was some unknown guy around her daughter all the time. Before his arrival, his daughter had been a quiet and docile child, but now they spend all their time together, and he couldn't see his poor daughter at all. The man literally wept at the realization that his daughter had never been like this before and had always been a good, sensitive child. And that was the reason why the Earl had asked Riedel Cross to keep Graham away from his daughter. And she looked at the crying man excitedly and asked why he had chosen her. Then she said that the other servants thought the girl beautiful, but she could not compare in her looks with Lady Melina. And then she thought that even at a distance, the lady seemed madly beautiful and mysterious, like an angel. So she was really magnificent. But he calmly explained that the reason was that the girl was the only one of all the maids in the house who had no reaction to Graham at all, and was not in love with him, though it was hard for him to admit it. But Graham was indeed insanely handsome, and he had heard earlier from Madame Maymore that all the servants were crazy about him. The protagonist, carefully looking at the Count, did not understand his train of thought, because a girl in love is best suited in the role of a seductress. But the man calmly waved his hands and explained that to seduce someone, you need to be in equal conditions, so he certainly cannot like a girl who is attracted only by his appearance. Though there would have been a chance if they had someone as distinguished-looking as his daughter, Lady Melina. But such a beauty could not be found anywhere else. Remembering the image of the beautiful lady, the protagonist immediately realized that Earl Stingers was absolutely right, and apparently he realized from the beginning that beauty would not help matters. So he decided to resort to another strategy. And it made sense. But after, to the shock of the protagonist, the Count said that Miss Maymore saw that after Graham's arrival, the protagonist continued to work normally, and then in shock realized that if she knew that this would happen, she would also pretend to be madly in love. Then the Count continued that it was for this reason that he decided that the girl would be the best candidate for the role of Graham's mistress. But they excitedly informed the Earl that it was a great pity she could not help him, for she did not want to seduce a man for whom she felt nothing, and she does not think that Mr. Graham will believe it. Moreover, it may hurt Lady Melina's feelings. But then she turned her gaze to the madly serious Earl Stingers, and to the anxious woman beside him. Madame Maymore was literally in shock, not understanding how the protagonist could say something like that, because she said it to the girl's father. Then the Count rose from his seat and held out his hand to her. Looking at this, the protagonist immediately realized that in all likelihood she had made a huge mistake by saying this, and in all likelihood she would be beaten because of her refusal and forced. But to the great surprise of the man, grabbed from behind his shoulders and frantically begged for help, for no one but Riedel Cross could help him. And so it was very important to him that the protagonist did everything possible to Graham less contact with his daughter. The protagonist tried to explain to him that it was not about money. Then he said that he was ready to triple or quintuple her salary. The girl was madly enthusiastic about this amount of money, but then shook her head, interrupting herself from such seductive thoughts, and thought about the fact that she could not seduce Graham, looking at his frightening face. And she would not be able to do it even if she was given $1 million. So the main character refused him and said that money is not the most important thing for her, and therefore she could not help him anyway. But at that moment, Count Stingers rose dangerously and leaned over the protagonist with a sinister smile and informed her that he was not going to offer her any more salary. So she should think carefully about how much she wants to refuse him, because earlier he had learned that the protagonist's family lives on his estate. And she should not pretend that Riedel Cross does not understand what he really does and how he earns money. So making the friendliest smile possible but still remaining as intimidating as possible, Count Stingers informed that everyone would be fine if Riedel Cross just took his money and did his job well, and then no one would get hurt. Then the girl went to Lady Melina, who looked at her excitedly and asked if this was her new maid, that is, a servant who serves only noble ladies. The main character was excited, looking at her, and admired her beauty. Thought that the girl looks like an angel. Then excitedly replied that she is indeed her new maid and her name is Riedel Cross. But suddenly the voice of Mr. Graham suddenly sounded, asking why the girl had been appointed by somebody else. For ladies should usually choose their own chambermaid. And the protagonist was frightened, looking at him and thinking that at this moment Mr. Graham reminded her even more of the Emperor. But Madame Maymore, calmly pushing the protagonist closer to Lady Melina, said that this girl was chosen by the master and directed her to her. From what she heard, Lady Melina was madly surprised. She smiled brightly and said that she would be glad to have her help and asked Riedel Cross to take care of her. The lady bowed, embarrassed by the attention, and thought that her name sounded especially nice in the pronunciation of such a beautiful woman, which was very flattering. After that, Lady Melina, still looking at the protagonist, carefully pointed her hand at Mr. Graham and said that this young man was making her daily routine. So Riedel Cross would be much better off going to him if she had any questions. She, looking at the man in front of her, realized that he was a bit intimidating. But then she shifted her gaze to Madame Maymore, who looked at her with a serious look and literally made it clear to Riedel Cross that she had to work hard in order to fulfill the Earl's commission. She realized in great shock that her main task now was to seduce Graham at any cost. Finally, the man informed Melina that he was going to leave and went to the door, and then called Riedel to follow him and told her that you would be sure to tell her what to do. As she followed him, the protagonist couldn't help but notice the obvious resemblance to the Emperor, and so looking at the young man walking down the long corridor, all she did was try to convince herself that this man was not the Emperor. And his eyes were violet, so they were just alike. At this time, the man told about the fact that he was in charge of almost all of Lady Melina's affairs, so that the main heroine would only have to deal with the closet. But the girl absolutely did not listen to him, thinking about the fact that if Graham was really the Emperor, she would once again become imprisoned in the tower. Then, after a short silence, Mr. Graham went on to say that the girl should do the closet after Lady Melina had gone. But then a question came excitedly from the man as to whether she had listened to him. And the girl, frightened out of her wits, answered at once that she had, and that she had remembered everything. But looking at his face, she could not deny that my heart was beating very fast because of the great fear, and she really did not understand whether she could now be with a man so like her tormentor in her past life. But suddenly he pulled his hand to her, and she would not have been able to hold back her tears, frightened looking at this picture, and thought about the fact that it cannot be that people are so similar. So she realized that she urgently needed to run away before anything terrible happened to her. But the next moment he did not strike her as she had expected, but put his white-gloved hand gently on her forehead, and Riedel Cross, shocked, did not understand what he was doing or why he was doing it, and so she frightfully suggested that perhaps Graham was trying to tear her head off in this way. But he only excitedly looked at the young girl in front of him and said that she had no fever, and asked if she was all right and how she was feeling, because she didn't look well at all. Then she excitedly remembered the moment when the same young man gave her a handkerchief, when he thought about the fact that the protagonist was feeling bad and realized that maybe he wasn't trying to hurt her then either. But the next moment, in order not to embarrass her, Graham turned around and started walking away, telling the protagonist that her diligence is commendable and insanely good, but should not be overdone, as she can get sick and feel bad. Looking at the departing young man, Riedel is shocked to wonder if someone like him could care about her. As a result, after a short time, they went into the dressing room, and Riedel Cross was thinking excitedly that Graham looked like her nightmare, but was taking care of her, which was insanely strange. But the man did not notice such a lostness of the protagonist, as she carefully told that Riedel Cross should prepare clothes and jewelry, and afterwards take them to the room, and pointing to the door said that this door was the direct way to Lady Melina's bedroom, and warned that everything must be ready by the next day, and asked if the protagonist understood. She was so frightened and quick to answer that she didn't notice how she bit her tongue, and then she scolded herself for it, realizing that she should behave naturally so that no one would notice the strangeness because she was safe. And after remembering the image of the Emperor, she thought that it would be quite embarrassing if it turned out that this young man absolutely unrelated to him. But then she was horrified and could not cope with herself, and again saw in Graham the image of the Emperor that was drawing a sword over her head. So at once she bowed apologetically and said she was terribly sorry for her behavior and expected a blow. But to her great relief, Mr. Graham did not react in any way and left her alone, simply walking past her and closing the door behind him. In the next moment, the girl immediately slid down the wall, for her legs had become insanely weak. She tried to catch her breath in shock and realized that she was absolutely unable to cope with this face. And afterwards, she thought that although Graham wasn't horrible, that face made her feel like she was back in the tower, And no matter how much she convinced herself it was a different person, when she sees Mr. Graham's face, she just shifts and her whole body aches again, like when her arm was cut off. And afterwards she cried and thought that she wanted to go home. But she realized that if she ran away, something terrible would happen to her family. She realized that if she ran away, something terrible would happen to her family. She thought about the fact that the Earl had said earlier that all she had to do was seduce Graham, but had never mentioned what would happen if his plan didn't work. But afterwards, she decided that she would just pretend to seduce the butler and get 5 times her salary. And in the end, she would keep Lady Melina and Mr. Graham in love, so everyone but the Earl would benefit. So she's thinking that everything's going to be okay. Her plan's going to work, and she's going to have to pull herself together. All this time, Graham was standing outside the door excitedly, who had heard all this and was absolutely at a loss as to how he should react to such things, and he seemed madly depressed. So he went to Lady Melina, who noticed at once that the butler looked strange enough to ask what was the reason for his silence and his strange behavior. But the butler only clutched his face in an agitated manner, as if to hide his embarrassment, and inquired whether there was anything so unpleasant in his face. Lady Melina was literally in shock, not knowing what he was talking about, and then Graham calmly explained that other people's taste should be respected, but because of his face, someone wants to go home, and it makes him very uncomfortable. The girl was indeed shocked and wondered what he was talking about and why he was saying such a thing. But then she looked at Graham excitedly and wondered who was trying to escape from behind his face. And then she assumed and asked if it was her new chambermaid. He only nodded in agreement and said that it was, confirming her guess. And after Melina thought that this is crazy weird behavior, after all the other girls just adore him. And apparently Riedel Cross reported that she hates Graham's face, and this was quite strange behavior, and then reported that she is already starting to like this young girl. Then she looked carefully at Mr. Graham in front of her and told him that it was not yet necessary to jump to conclusions, as there was a possibility that he had misunderstood something, and they still did not know what this lady was, so they needed to understand who she was and why her father Earl Stingers had sent her to serve. But Graham couldn't think of anything else but that when he first met Riedel Cross, he had thought the first time that perhaps the girl was not feeling well, but the second time her eyes looked very unusual. There was no hostility or contempt in them, only great fear. So Graham decided that he must be sure of what was going on. After which he calmly reached for the bucket of yellow paint that stood beside Lady Melina and dropped it on the floor apologetically, not even pretending to do so by accident. Lady Melina, only excitedly looking at it with a smile, asked why he was doing that. And the man, calmly looking at the girl in front of him, informed that by a huge accident the paint spilled, so he is obliged to buy and bring a new one. So the protagonist, together with a young man, went in one carriage to go shopping in the store, and the girl absolutely did not understand why she went with Graham. After all, she herself could go on behalf of the mistress. She was insanely embarrassed. At the next moment, the carriage stopped and Graham stated that they had arrived, and so the first to get out of his carriage, he reached out his hand to the protagonist to help her down. But Riedel did not understand Graham at all and suggested that perhaps he was doing something similar to keep the door from closing in her face. But she did not need it at that moment. Seeing that she was thinking, Graham asked if she was going to stay in the carriage and did not want to go down. But she just jumped down the last step excitedly and ran forward to the store, leaving the shocked man alone, who pondered the reason for such behavior on the part of the protagonist. And the girl was happy that such a trick worked, and she successfully descended without even looking at the young man's face. But suddenly, Graham soon turned around and told the girl to stay close to him, because it was very easy to get lost in this place. Riedel Cross agreed excitedly, and then, keeping her distance between them, followed. She thought that this time she hadn't even bitten her tongue, and everything was going according to plan until she saw the young man's face. They went to the store, where the clerk asked Mr. Graham what had brought them at such an early hour, but he showed him a paper on which was written everything they needed, handed it to the clerk saying they had come for it, and asked if he could prepare it. He smiled happily and said that they had some in stock, so he asked the gentleman to come with him so that they could collect the order together. He asked who the beautiful lady was with the young man, for he had not been seen with the maids before. The lady was surprised to hear that her name was Riedel Cross, and she was my Lady Melina's chambermaid. When the salesman heard this, he elbowed the man, saying that the lady he had arrived with was insanely beautiful. But Graham did not react to this, but gave Riedel Cross an attentive look and said that he would go and look on the second floor, so the girl could stay and look at what she was interested in. While she was walking between the shelves, she noticed a young man being accosted by some lady, and he tried to convince her that there were people here and she couldn't act like that. And he looked very scared, but it didn't stop her at all. And she said with a smile on her face that the young man was really nice and she wasn't going to do anything bad, so he shouldn't be so afraid. Then she said that she wasn't his wife and he could just call her by her name. Seeing this picture, the main character was truly shocked and did not even realize what was really going on. But when understanding caught up with her, she immediately realized that she had to do something to save this poor guy. She walked loudly and then said, no less loudly, that she really needed the paint the lady had asked her for and pretended to talk to herself, and only calmed down when she saw the woman who had been harassing the young man run away. Looking at this picture, Riedel thought that, apparently, in addition to being a maid, she now had a job as a rescuer of the unfortunate, and was insanely proud of herself for helping. But suddenly, an excited young man ran up to her, who at once realized that the girl had done it deliberately, so he thanked the lady for this help. But the one only calmly waved away and said that she did not do anything, so it is not worth thanking, and smiled at the young man, thought that the guy looks like an innocent sheep, and asked if he was okay or not, and how he feels after such a thing. Embarrassed by such attention from the protagonist, the man smiled and said that he was really okay, and thanks to the protagonist, nothing terrible had happened to him. Looking at such an excited and embarrassed face, she thought that the guy in front of her is really insanely cute. At that moment, he turned to the girl and asked if he could learn the name of his savior. The protagonist happily introduced herself, and in the next moment the man smiled and said that they were an insanely beautiful name that suited her, and introduced himself in response. His name was Royden Bernstein, and he said that although a little ashamed to talk about such things, but he is a simple artist. Looking in such a smiling face of a young man, the girl thought that he looked like a puppy, and it looked very cute. After that, she stated that he looked like an artist and said that she was a maid in the house of Earl Stingers. When the young man heard this, he was madly excited and asked if it was about the Earl. Then the protagonist realized that he always had a bad reputation, but tried to convince the guy that it's not as bad as he thinks because her work is not too difficult. And she thought that her work is not difficult as long as she does not have to seduce Graham. But the next moment, to the great surprise of the main character, the man reached for his tie and asked the girl to wait a little bit because he wanted to make her a small gift. The main character, excitedly looking at this, absolutely did not understand why he unties his tie and was a little embarrassed by this. But after a moment, this yellow tie turned into a beautiful yellow rose, and holding it out to the main character, the guy informed her that it would be a small payment for her help. The girl, admiringly looking at this brooch, and after putting it on her outer garment, joyfully looked at the flower and informed her that she hadn't done anything special, but still thanked her for such a gift and accepted it. Seeing that the main character liked the man, smiled brightly, realizing that he was able to please her, and the girl, only with some dissatisfaction looking at the young guy, absolutely did not understand what was the meaning of his smile, and he looked too cheerful, so mentally asked him to stop. But suddenly, a salesman came down from the second floor and turned to the young man and asked why he hadn't left yet. But he just waved his hand and said that he was leaving, and said goodbye to Riedel Cross and said that they would see each other later. The protagonist waved her hand at him in response and thought about the fact that the young man really did look like a little puppy, and it was cute enough. But afterwards she felt some strange stare on her, as if a huge hole was about to be drilled in her back. And when she turned her gaze back, she saw the displeased face of Mr. Graham, who was watching her intently. And then he inquired who the young man was. But in the next moment, she realized that his face at that moment resembled the face of the emperor. So she was shaken again, and she knew that if she didn't answer him or apologize or do something, she would be hurt very badly. So she begged herself to do something before the man swung his sword. But she was saved by the shopkeeper, who said that Mr. Graham probably did not know the young man, for he was a friend of his, and had recently come from the capital and was an artist, and his work was very popular, and he had seen it a couple of times, so he could assure her that the portraits were really a work of art. The protagonist was insanely grateful that the salesman had saved her and was shaking with fear and rejoiced that she had survived. Afterwards, she thought about the fact that although she had done nothing wrong, she still tried to explain everything to Graham for some reason and stated that it was due to the fact that although Mr. Graham's eyes and the Emperor's eyes were different colors, their faces were exactly the same, so she had unconsciously behaved in such a way. But at that moment, the seller who pointed to one of the paintings and invited everyone to look at it. It was the painting of the same lady who had previously molested the young artist. And looking at it, Graham concentrated that this is a truly exquisite work. The seller only smilingly informed that the artist is really talented, so all his works are quite refined. And apparently the lady that is depicted paid a huge pile of money to support the young artist. After that, he said goodbye to the young people and said that he would be glad to see them in his store again. So the protagonist got to her house, and again the same picture happened as before, where Mr. Graham gave her his hand to help her. And the girl understood that Mr. Graham would not accompany her as a lady, and apparently the reason was something else. Then she tried to convince herself in a panic that she should not look at his face, and all attention should be on his hand. And looking at the outstretched hand, she did not understand what the gesture meant. So she hung the basket on his arm, realizing that that was probably his true purpose. Then jumping down, she realized that Graham must have asked her to give her the basket from the beginning, and she had misinterpreted his gesture. But suddenly he called out to her sharply, causing the girl to bite her tongue as she answered and stared at the floor in horror, not knowing how to behave. And the young man, looking at this picture, was only excitedly asking why she was behaving like this, but he left without explaining. Riedel Cross only looked at him and did not understand and what he wanted her to say to him. But afterwards she thought sadly that it did not matter to her at all, and she was only glad that the young man had left. As a result, Mr. Graham, going up the steps of the mansion to Lady Melina's room, looked at the basket that was handed to him by the main heroine and did not understand why even the elementary norms of etiquette made Riedel Cross so nervous, and reflected that he had previously thought that she hated all men. But when he noticed her talking to the painter, he realized that the girl was acting quite friendly to the man she was seeing for the first time. And she was smiling insanely bright. It was a smile he'd never seen on her face before. For every time she was near him, all that was on her face was fear and tears. And so Graham was very much concerned as to why it was with him that the girl behaved so aloofly. And what was the cause of her hatred of him? A little more time passed, and the main character slept peacefully in her bed. But it seems that she was worried about something because she was shaking as if from a strong cold, and it was atypical because in the room where the maids lived was always warm and comfortable. She rose from her seat and reached out to close the window, for she thought she had forgotten to do so cold was the room now. But in the end, to her great horror, when she opened her eyes, she saw that she was back in the same tower and tried to find answers for herself as to how she had ended up here. And she was horrified to realize that she had apparently gone back in time, or that everything that had happened before was just a good dream. But suddenly I was distracted by the voice of the emperor, who was holding her mother hostage, who was shaking with fear and calling her daughter's name without realizing what was happening or what he was doing here. Looking at this picture, the main character could not find the strength to do anything but to call her mother in horror, and then kneel down and bowing before the emperor apologized for everything that had happened and asked the emperor not to do anything. But he only said that the girl should not have run away from here in the first place, and pulling his sword out of its sheath, said that he was giving the Knight Cross the last chance to show respect to his mother. Then looking at her with disdain, he swung at her, intending to take away the woman's head, and said that he could not stop the sword of the traveler and was not going to do so. The protagonist tried her best to use her magic to protect her, but everyone knew that no magic could stop the sword, so she tearfully realized what awaited her. And in the end, her mother was decapitated because the magic was destroyed. Her face was so full of horror and fright that it looked like she was going to die of a heart attack. But then she found that it was all a dream. She was still at Stinger's Manor, and it was a relief to her. But then she was bent over in her bed, remembering the horrible picture of her dead mother, and realized that she could never use magic because she mustn't get caught. The lady looked excitedly at the emerald ring and asked why Riedel Cross had chosen it, but she said, a little puzzled, that she thought a ring with a green stone would look best. Then she said that if the girl didn't like it, she could change it. But she smiled happily and looked at the ring on her finger and assured the protagonist that everything was fine and that she really liked everything. Then she told her that green was her favorite color. Riedel Cross looked at the lady carefully and thought that she should remember the fact that her favorite color was green. Then Melina looked at her dress, specifically at the lace trim at the bottom, and wondered if Riedel Cross was into lace weaving, which is when another fabric or lace is attached to the main fabric. The main character excitedly said that it seemed to her that it would be better to decorate the dress with flowers, and it would look much more beautiful than if decorated usually with braid. And then she realized that she probably should have asked first. But to her great surprise, she was not yelled at or scolded, and Lady Melina smiled happily and said that Riedel Cross was really talented and that she liked it all very much. Then she confessed that she didn't usually like to change anything in her dresses. The protagonist, hearing this, thought that although she had made a mistake, the beautiful Lady Melina had praised her even for it, and so she thought the girl was really beautiful. At the next moment, Melina, fixing her hair, said that she was usually very bored with buying new clothes, and although it was very nice to wear a beautiful dress, it was difficult to choose them. Then the protagonist, with a smile on her face, asked if the mistress would mind if she chose a dress for her next time, so that she would not have to do it. Melina was madly surprised by such a suggestion, and the protagonist realized with embarrassment that she had probably acted too presumptuously. Melina turned to her and smilingly said that her hairstyle was different from today's, but Riedel Cross really had good taste, so she said that in that case, she was also ready to leave the choice of the dress to her next time. Looking at the beautiful lady, the girl excitedly said that she would take care of it because it was her duty as a lady's maid. But Melina still smilingly said that she only trusted her because she had a good sense of style. The protagonist was madly confused and excited to hear such a thing, because just now Lady Melina herself, whom she had read so beautifully, praised her sense of style, and she gives compliments to someone who understands nothing about modern fashion, but afterwards rejoiced that she still remembered what hairstyles will be in fashion from her past life. Melina smiled at the protagonist and said with great joy that she was really happy that Riedel Cross was here with her and was helping her. The protagonist was literally dazzled by this smile and thought that her mistress was definitely a fairy and thought that she was the Blue Rose Fairy. Then she thought that she was extremely lucky to be alive now, so she was very happy that she was reborn and could live such a good life. But suddenly a voice came from behind the door, and the protagonist was immediately excited and realized that it was Mr. Graham's voice. But to her great surprise, Melina did not behave like a lady in love at all. So she unhappily informed the young man that he should wait and not come in yet, as they were not finished. Then she also unhappily informed him that she had previously asked Mr. Graham to wait in the carriage, but he again did as he wished. The heroine, looking at the young girl awkwardly, informed her that she was ready and had only to put on her shoes. At that moment, Melina said that now that Riedel Cross was with her, Graham could do his main work as he was a butler and could not spend so much time with her. She was really surprised when the mistress said about the main work. After that, she was surprised didn't lovers have to be around each time, and this kind of reaction was not at all like lovers. Eventually, there was another knock on the door to Melina's room by Mr. Graham, who asked permission to enter. The girl only glanced unhappily at the door and said that they were finished and he could come in. And after carefully looking at the man in front of her, said that he is not obliged to behave like that. The main character immediately realized that between them some strange atmosphere, because at a distance they seemed to be a sweet couple, but up close everything was completely different. Lady Melina told the protagonist that they were leaving and asked Riedel Cross to choose her dress and hairstyle next time. She happily agreed, but after looking at the sad face of the lady, she didn't understand why she was so upset. And looking at the departing couple, I didn't believe that there could really be any relationship between them, because their interactions looked very strained and forced, and it looked like Lady was indifferent to him. So Riedel wondered if there was any connection between them, and what it was. After all, they were too close for the mistress and the rumors. And besides, the protagonist seemed more interested in Graham than in the girl herself, and as if there were a mystery that hid the true relationship of the two. But afterwards, she ordered herself not to think about it. It didn't matter how they felt about each other, so she should get on with her work. And then she sat down to embroider. The girl realized that she could simply inform the Earl of Stingers that his daughter and Mr. Graham were not lovers. But in that case, the Earl would be sure to dismiss Graham. But then she realized that if the man was dismissed, he could not be so near the lady. Then she wondered why her lady kept Graham so close to her if she did not like him at all. And perhaps she had some weaknesses. Then she remembered her past life, namely that her weakness, which the emperor had taken advantage of so easily, was her family and loved ones. And the emperor could use it against her to subjugate her. So the girl thought that perhaps Melina had such weaknesses too, and though Graham was not the emperor, perhaps he was no better. Melina was surprised and wondered if she had been waiting for her all this time. Melina only smiled awkwardly and said that she was her maid, so it was her duty. But Melina calmly explained that Graham was to be with her tonight, so she shouldn't have waited so long. The girl added that Mr. Graham needed a rest too, and thought that she couldn't leave the two of them alone. The next moment, Lady Melina turned her gaze to the man and asked if he would mind if she left. The man said with the coldest possible look that Lady Melina could do as she pleased. Seeing the young man's face like that, Riedel thought that she didn't understand why he was looking so frighteningly at her since nothing had happened. But the next moment, smiling happily, Melina put her arm around Riedel Cross and I started to leave. Then she told Graham that she would be with her today instead of him and would help her with everything. Looking at this picture, the protagonist did not understand why the girl was pulling her by the arm. And afterwards, with great relief, when they moved away, Melina thanked her for having met her. When the protagonist turned around to look at the young man, who stayed behind their backs, she clearly felt a very frightening aura, and it seemed as if he was now ready to kill anyone who gets in his way. Because of what she felt very frightened and sharply turned around and went with Melina to her room and just prayed that everything she does is absolutely not in vain and she understood everything correctly. In the end, the protagonist helped Milady to sort out the hair of clothes and put her to bed and then said that the mistress can rest in peace. And Melina smiled happily, thanked her for her good work. But at the last moment, the protagonist excitedly turned to her and wanted to ask the question whether Graham was blackmailing her, but then excitedly ran out of the room and said goodnight. As she walked out the door, she thought about the fact that Melina wouldn't have said anything. But if it was true, she would have to help her mistress. She was so kind, and she couldn't let anyone do to her what she had done to her in the past. After which she gathered a small amount of magic in her hands, and looking at the glowing golden orb, she immediately understood that even if her mistress was in danger, there was no way she could use her magic anymore. So she went back to her room and slept peacefully through the night. But the next morning, when she was dressing and found a handkerchief in her pocket, she realized that it belonged to Mr. Graham, and she had been carrying it about with her for a long time in order to get it back. But she was madly afraid, for every time she turned to him and saw his face, she immediately began to shake with fear. But then she remembered that this was not the main problem. As she approached the door to knock, she heard voices and did not understand who could have come to Melina's house so early in the morning. She realized that it might be Mr. Graham, and so she knocked excitedly, but Melina's voice answered and asked her to wait. Eventually, when she entered the room, she saw two young men, Mr. Graham looking intently at the protagonist, and my lady was turned away, hiding the fact that she was crying. So the girl looked at the young man in front of her with all the fury and absolutely did not understand what he had done to her, and why now the lady was all in tears. And it would seem that the protagonist was now ready to deal with Graham on the spot. But then she saw his serious and very frightening look of violet eyes. Because of what immediately shook with fear and called herself pathetic for not being able to cope even with such a small thing as to look into his eyes, and absolutely did not understand what could happen between these two. Eventually, Graham turned to Melina and was told that Melina should let him know when he was ready, and then he would definitely come back. She just agreed and let him go so he could leave in peace. At the next moment, the protagonist, left alone with her mistress, excitedly came closer to her and asked her if she was all right. But she assured her that everything was all right and told her that her eyes were red because something had gotten into them. So everything was really all right. But the protagonist didn't believe it at all. Looking at her crying face, she realized that she was completely red in tears. In the end, they started to choose dresses and hairstyles, and the happy Mrs. Molina asked Riedel Cross to take good care of her. She hoped she would. The latter only agreed to her request. Her mind was on something else, and she worried that she didn't know what was going on, because maybe Graham was doing to Melina what the Emperor had done to her. But she knew that if she started conjuring, she'd go straight to the tower. And that was the last thing she wanted. But she decided that she could do things in other ways, and realized with determination that she didn't have to reveal her talent for magic or that she was the one using it. She ended up carrying the mistress's tomorrow, and she knew that if anything happened, she'd be my lady's #1 suspect, especially if anyone noticed any traces of magic around her. As a result, bringing tomorrow to the girl asked the mistress how late she would return, and so calmly told her that she hoped to be free quickly because there is not so much to do today as usual. Hearing this, the protagonist was madly pleased because she realized that she could do everything to ensure that Graham didn't harm her. The girl smiled affectionately and told Riedel Cross that she shouldn't wait for them every time, but she only said with a smile on her face that it was her job as a chambermaid, so she couldn't do otherwise. Then they went to mistress's room, and the girl said that she would give her a bath so that she could rest. But then she was horrified to hear that for some reason the door would not open, and apparently it was jammed, and the problem was in the lock. So she handed her headdress and umbrella to the mistress and asked Lady Mylan to wait for a while she asked the other maids to take care of her. The mistress tried to convince her that the matter was not so urgent and she should not be so worried. But at that moment, Riedel Cross was already running away and said that she would be back soon to do it. But she was thinking about the fact that even if she brought the master, no one else would be able to open the door, because she was trapped by imperial magic, which she had mastered during her time in the tower. It was at least something good that had happened to her. In the end, Mrs. Molina came down the stairs and noticed Graham, who asked what the problem was and why she had come down so soon and was not in her room. But she calmly explained that the reason was that something had happened to her door, and that was why Riedel Cross had gone to fetch the master. When Graham heard this, he said that he was ready to take care of her then. But she was abruptly approached by a maid who informed her that Riedel Cross asked for help. And then Melina waved Graham's hand, saying that she thought Riedel had already taken care of everything, so she didn't need his help. The operation the protagonist was conducting was called Pretend to be a Tree in the Forest. In the end, Riedel asked a lot of maids to take care of Lady Melina, and they all hung around her and offered to give her massages. It was all an elaborate plan by Riedel Cross to have a lot of people around the mistress to provide her with an alibi, as well as security from Graham. So she went to the worker who was fixing the door and asked how the job was going. But he said that the door was acting strangely, and it was very strange that it just suddenly stopped opening. But then the protagonist offered the tortured guy a drink and said she could get him some water. At this time, Madame Melina sat surrounded by maids and absolutely did not understand since when she became the center of the universe and why there were so many maids around her. But suddenly, Mr. Graham suddenly came up and looked at Riedel Cross and asked what the trouble was with the door. She was shocked to see him and bent down to tell him that she didn't think the door would open soon. So she asked him to tell Mrs. Molina that it would take some time to open the door, but he calmly told her that he would make sure to tell her. Then the heroine, seeing him go, asked him to stop and handed him the earring, saying that the mistress had dropped it in the morning and asked him to give it to her. And the girl herself thought that this little accessory, which Graham was sure to touch in order to give it to her, would not arouse suspicion, and so her plan worked well. And these earrings would keep suspicion away from her, for she had done nothing wrong. She had only asked for them to be returned to her mistress. He did so, but Melina excitedly announced that both earrings were there, and so it was strange enough. But the next moment, Graham turned around and asked if there were any servants around. But Melina calmly explained that Riedel Cross was worried that she couldn't take good care of her, so she asked them all to come, and since it would take some time to fix the doors, she told Graham that she would stay in the room downstairs. He bowed and agreed and said that he would tell the servants to prepare a bath, and he would order them to come downstairs to the room. After that, he immediately left, and on his way out, he thought that everything that was happening was very suspicious and somehow unusual, but he thought that maybe he had just imagined it. At this time, the main character excitedly entered the room where Mistress Melina was taking a bath, and there she was made excited by the maid Eris, her friend. At this moment, the girl asked her to be quiet and asked if her friend had added her favorite aromatic oil, and then said that she would finish with all the business in this room and she could go to rest in peace. When the protagonist saw the mistress resting in the bathtub, she made sure that she was asleep and was glad that the girl fell asleep so quickly because of the chamomile oil. And then she used her magic power and let it flow into the water in which the mistress now lay, and convinced herself that she was doing it to help. Eventually, time passed, and Mrs. Melina woke up in the bathroom surprised that apparently the maids had just left without even saying anything to her. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a handkerchief that was lying on the floor, and this handkerchief belonged to Graham, and she knew it well. At this time, Rydell excitedly ran back to the young man who was waiting for her by the door he was fixing, and she thought about the fact that she had to run away very fast because my lady started to wake up and she was running so fast that she even fell. Finally, she excitedly ran to the young man and handed him the water. She apologized for the long wait. He was madly surprised that she was in a hurry and asked if it was water from the stream, and she had run so far. But the next moment there was a young man's voice. It was Mr. Graham, who asked the worker if they had not finished yet. The protagonist looked at him and thought that she was very lucky that she had arrived in time and had not been noticed. If she had, she would have been in serious trouble. At this time, the worker calmly explained that he still couldn't figure out why. But if he didn't open the door, he'd have to break in and take it off its hinges. The butler listened attentively, looked at his watch, and after a moment's thought said that it was late enough that Mrs. Melina had gone to bed downstairs, and said that the workmen might come to finish tomorrow. At this time, the protagonist was already late at night walking to her room and thinking about the fact that she had managed to cleanse the body of Mrs. Melina, and at the same time she had secured an alibi. So if she gets to her room, it means that the operation was a success. But suddenly she bumped into Graham, and the man, who was looking at her worriedly, held out his hand to help her and apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare her. And then he asked if she was all right. The main character was looking at his hand worriedly, and all those moments when he had helped her out of the carriage and she had reacted so stupidly came back to her. But at that moment, seeing such a reaction, Graham at once withdrew his hand from her and apologized, saying that he had not thought of it, and warned that tomorrow Mrs. Melina had some business to attend to, and he would go with her, and warned her that the girl could take her time and not worry. And then he turned and left abruptly. And Rydell didn't know how to behave. And she realized that she didn't realize why she had asked him to stop. But the next moment, awkwardly and still shaking with fear, she wished the butler good night, and thought that it was the first time she had ever looked him straight in the eye. Graham smiled and wished the girl a good night's rest with a soft, calm voice. He seemed very pleased with the reaction of the protagonist. He noticed that the ice between them had begun to melt. Looking at the young man, the girl realized that for the first time she did not feel so terrible at the sight of him. And after she was already in the room with herself before going to bed, she immediately began to remember all the times she'd encountered Graham and realized that he'd never hurt her. On the contrary, he behaved like a gentleman from the very first time she'd met him. She supposed that perhaps there was no connection between Lady Melina and the butler, and that she had probably just made it all up. And she was insanely ashamed that she had been so badly mistaken. She then resolutely told herself that when she woke up she would be sure to give the handkerchief to Graham and finally speak to him and apologize for her rudeness earlier. And then she was suddenly awakened by a scolding maid informing her that she was expected and that she was very late and must run away as soon as possible to do her duty. At this time, Graham, going to Mrs. Melina with a smile on his face, was thinking that for some reason this morning he was very light at heart. And perhaps it was because of the good night wish from Rydell Cross. Finally, when he entered the room, he saw Lady Malina busy with her business and inquired how the papers were being handled. And Graham, in reply, immediately handed them to the girl. But for some reason, he was suddenly struck by a lightning bolt, and he didn't know what it was about. This did not go unnoticed by Melina, who was surprised by the butler's reaction and wondered what had happened, but Graham assured her that she should not worry. Then he began to look at his hand and suspected that it might have been static electricity. But then his gaze turned to the girl who was sitting in front of him and looked at him in surprise and mentally stated that she looked as if nothing had happened and everything was fine. So he decided that he should check his hunch again. And so he reached his hand closer to her hand that was now lying on the bed, and he was once again electrocuted, and this time much more strongly than the last. This did not go unnoticed by Melina, who screamed and asked what was happening to Graham and why he was acting like this. At that moment, the man still holding on to his sore arm looked at the girl seriously and told her that she was under magic and asked her what she had been doing since her return yesterday. Looking at such a determined young man, the mistress said that she had only slept here since the door of her room was not open. Graham thought that it had been business as usual until he brought the girl her earring, and immediately assumed that it might be one of the maids, but realized that it was not Riedel Cross, for she had been with the master all the time. But suddenly, an idea popped into his head, and so he resolutely turned around and told his mistress that he would be back soon and had not yet answered her question about this behavior. At this time, the protagonist had just arrived at her mistress's room, but to her great surprise, her friend came out of it and sadly said that she was terribly sorry for what had happened, and she had to go inside to see for herself what had happened there, because she couldn't tell her so directly. But Riedel Cross immediately realized that Iris looked more worried than usual. When she entered, she found Melina smiling and wishing her good morning. And next to her stood an insanely serious young man who looked very unhappy and surprised to see the protagonist. At that moment, her mind immediately flashed back to a past encounter with Graham, who said he had some business with the lady, so she could take her time. Seeing this picture, she thought that maybe they had already finished. Then Melina awkwardly fixed her hair and apologized for calling the girl so early, but said she had something to ask and it was really urgent. The next moment, Graham approached her to close the doors behind the girl, and their gazes at that moment crossed, and it seems that the man looks madly displeased and looked at her differently from before. And the protagonist, this clearly noticed and felt literally with her whole body, so excited asked did their conversation have to do with work. But Graham calmly informed her that the conversation would be about her powers, and Riedel Cross was literally shocked and immediately began to deny it, claiming she didn't know what she was talking about. At that moment, Melina smiled and looked at the protagonist carefully and said that earlier she and Graham had found a very strange thing and thought that maybe they should go to the Castor Tower to find out. When she heard about it, the protagonist was literally in shock, realizing that this is the worst possible outcome for her. After all, now Mrs. Melina and Graham are just threatening her, because she used a spell that only works on Graham, and apparently these two could not possibly know that she was guilty. It was just an assumption. And then thought about the fact that she was pretty good with defense magic on other types of charms added not so easily. But if the tower used tracking magic, she'd definitely get caught. And then at once the Emperor appeared in her mind and asked threateningly did the girl really hope that she could escape from him, and she was terrified and did not know how to act.